The telegram fluttered in Sheriff Thomas Fairchild's hand as he stared at the auction block where a woman and her daughter stood with downcast eyes, their skin darkened by the scorching Montana sun, and their spirits broken by circumstances he couldn't begin to comprehend. It was 1876, a year when America celebrated its centennial while still bearing the scars of a civil war that had torn the nation apart. And here in Montana City, human beings were being sold to the highest bidder. Sarah Whitaker clutched her mother's hand, her 20 years of life having taught her little beyond hardship and disappointment. Her father's gambling debts had finally caught up to them after his death, and now the bank was selling everything, including them as indentured servants, to cover what remained. The crowd murmured as the auctioneer described them as fine household help with gentle dispositions, though Sarah felt anything but gentle as she surveyed the leering faces of potential buyers. $200 for the pair, a voice called out from the back. Sarah felt her mother's fingers tighten around hers. Elizabeth Whitaker had once been a beauty, but years of worry had etched lines into her face and threaded silver through her dark hair. At 45, she still carried herself with dignity, even as she stood on display like cattle at market. $250, another voice countered. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in anticipation. $250 for this fine mother-daughter pair. Do I hear $300, $500? Came a clear, steady voice from the edge of the crowd. The spectators parted, revealing a tall figure astride a chestnut stallion. The man's face was shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but his posture spoke of confidence and purpose. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached the auction block, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. $500, the auctioneer repeated, eyes wide with surprise at the generous offer. Going once. $600, came a gruff voice from a heavyset man whose eyes lingered too long on Sarah. The tall stranger turned slightly, and Sarah caught her first glimpse of his face, sun-bronzed and weathered, with eyes the color of a summer sky. $800, he said calmly, never looking away from Sarah and her mother. $800, the auctioneer announced excitedly. Going once, going twice. Sold, relief and fear battled within Sarah's chest as the stranger approached. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30, with a neatly trimmed beard and those startling blue eyes that seemed to look straight through her. Thomas Fairchild, he introduced himself, extending a hand first to Elizabeth, then to Sarah. Sheriff of Montana City, you'll both come with me. Elizabeth's voice trembled. Sir, we've never been servants before. My husband was— I know who your husband was, Mrs. Whitaker, Sheriff Fairchild interrupted gently, and I have no intention of making either of you servants. Sarah found her voice at last. Then why did you buy us? A small smile lifted the corner of his mouth. Because no one should be sold like property, not in my town. He gestured toward the street where his horse waited. You'll both have a home and a name with me, as my housekeeper and her daughter if anyone asks, at least until we sort this situation out properly. Why would you do this for strangers? Sarah asked, suspicion evident in her tone. Let's just say I've seen enough injustice to last several lifetimes, he replied. Now, shall we go? I believe we've provided enough entertainment for the good people of Montana City today. As they walked away from the auction block, Sarah felt the stares of the townspeople boring into her back. She kept her head high despite her racing heart. Whatever awaited them at Sheriff Fairchild's home, it had to be better than the alternative. The sheriff's house sat at the edge of town, a modest 2-story structure with a covered porch and a small garden that had seen better days. A woman in her 60s emerged from the front door as they approached. Mrs. Hoffman, Sheriff Fairchild called out, I've brought guests who will be staying with us for a while. The older woman looked confused but nodded politely. I've kept the stew warm as you asked. Thank you, this is Mrs. Elizabeth Whitaker and her daughter Sarah. Ladies, this is Mrs. Hoffman, who helps keep this place from falling into complete disarray while I'm tending to my duties. Pleased to meet you, Elizabeth murmured, her refined accent revealing her Eastern upbringing. Mrs. Hoffman's eyes widened slightly. Likewise, she replied, clearly curious about the newcomer's circumstances. Inside, the house was simply furnished but clean and comfortable. The main room contained a sturdy oak table, several chairs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised Sarah with their variety. She had not expected a frontier sheriff to be a reader of Shakespeare and Dickens. Mrs. Hoffman has prepared the 2 upstairs bedrooms for you, Sheriff Fairchild explained. I hope you'll find everything satisfactory. We can discuss arrangements for the future tomorrow after you've rested. Elizabeth looked uncertain. Sheriff Fairchild, I don't wish to seem ungrateful, but I must understand our situation. You've purchased us. What exactly do you expect in return? The sheriff removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with the occasional strand of silver. Mrs. Whitaker, I expect nothing beyond perhaps some assistance around the house if you're willing to give it. As I said, no one should be sold like property. Your husband's debts were not yours to pay in such a manner. But the law, Elizabeth began. The law is not always just, he interrupted firmly. And sometimes it falls to men like me to correct those injustices where we can. He smiled then, the expression transforming his serious face. Now, I imagine you're both hungry. Mrs. Hoffman's beef stew is renowned throughout the territory. That first meal passed in awkward silence, with Sarah stealing glances at their benefactor when she thought he wasn't looking. There was something about him that didn't fit her image of a frontier lawman, a gentleness behind his obvious strength, an education behind his practical manner. After Mrs. Hoffman departed for her own home, Sheriff Fairchild showed them to their rooms. Sarah's was small but featured a real bed with clean linens, a washstand, and even a small mirror, luxuries she hadn't expected to see again after her father's death. Rest well, the sheriff said as he left them to settle in. Tomorrow is another day. Later that night, Sarah heard her mother weeping softly in the adjacent room. She slipped from her bed and padded across the hall. Mother, she whispered, sitting beside Elizabeth on the narrow bed. Are you all right? Elizabeth wiped her tears with the back of her hand. I keep thinking about what your father would say if he could see us now, sold at auction like slaves, dependent on the charity of a stranger. Father is the reason we were there in the first place, Sarah reminded her gently. His gambling put us in this position. He loved us, Sarah, in his way. I know, Sarah took her mother's hand, but now we must think of the future. Sheriff Fairchild seems decent enough. For now, Elizabeth said darkly, men's kindness often comes with conditions, Sarah. Remember that. You don't trust him? I don't trust our circumstances. We are entirely at his mercy. Sarah thought of the sheriff's clear blue eyes and the way he'd spoken to them with respect. Perhaps. But I think there are worse places to be than under Sheriff Fairchild's protection. The next morning brought sunshine streaming through the small window of Sarah's room. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar surroundings of their old home. Reality rushed back as she registered the unfamiliar furnishings and the sounds of movement downstairs. She dressed quickly in one of the 2 dresses they'd been allowed to keep and found her mother already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast alongside Mrs. Hoffman. Good morning, dear, Elizabeth said, looking more composed than she had the previous night. Mrs. Hoffman has been showing me where everything is kept. Sheriff Fairchild likes his coffee strong and his eggs over easy, Mrs. Hoffman explained. He's already gone out on his morning rounds but said he'd return midday. Sarah noticed her mother's spine stiffened slightly. We are not his servants, Elizabeth said quietly. Mrs. Hoffman's eyebrows rose. No, of course not, I merely thought. Well, it seems only fair to contribute to the household if we're to stay here. And we are staying here, Sarah asked. For now, her mother replied, until we determine what options remain to us. Those options seemed few indeed. With no money, no property, and the scandal of the auction hanging over them, Sarah couldn't imagine where else they might go. She took a deep breath and reached for an apron hanging by the stove. I'll help with breakfast, she said. And then perhaps you might show us around the property, Mrs. Hoffman. I noticed a garden that could use some attention. The older woman nodded approvingly. Been telling the sheriff for years he ought to plant more than just potatoes and beans. Man can't live on that alone. By midday, Sarah had turned the soil in what would become a proper kitchen garden, while her mother had reorganized the pantry and mended several of the sheriff's shirts that Mrs. Hoffman had pointed out needed attention. The physical labor felt good after the helplessness of recent days, giving Sarah a sense of purpose and control she'd sorely missed. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until a shadow fell across the freshly turned earth. Looking up, she found Sheriff Fairchild watching her with an expression of surprise. "Miss Whitaker," he said, dismounting. "This is unexpected." Sarah brushed the soil from her hands and stood. "I hope you don't mind. The garden seemed neglected and I thought, no, I don't mind at all." "It's just that I didn't bring you here to work." "What did you bring us here for, Sheriff?" Sarah asked directly, meeting his gaze. He seemed taken aback by her forthrightness. "To give you shelter and time to recover from your ordeal." "And then what?" Sheriff Fairchild removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "I haven't thought that far ahead, to be honest. I saw an injustice and acted to correct it. The rest? Well, the rest we'll figure out as we go along." Sarah studied him, trying to discern his true motives. "Why did you really buy us, Sheriff? And don't tell me it was just because you hate injustice. Men don't spend $800 on a principal." A long moment passed before he answered. "My mother and sister found themselves in similar circumstances after my father died when I was 15. A man purchased their indenture contracts. He was not kind to them." His voice hardened. "When I saw you and your mother on that auction block, I couldn't stand by and watch history repeat itself." The personal revelation surprised Sarah. "I'm sorry about your family." "It was a long time ago," he said, though his eyes suggested the wounds were still fresh. "But it taught me that sometimes the law needs a helping hand to find justice." He gestured toward the house. "Now, shall we see what Mrs. Hoffman has prepared for lunch? You must be hungry after all this work." Inside, they found Elizabeth setting the table while Mrs. Hoffman stirred something that smelled delicious. The older woman brightened at the sheriff's entrance. "Right on time," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker's been a tremendous help. Got the whole pantry reorganized so a person can actually find things." Sheriff Fairchild hung his hat on a peg by the door. "I appreciate your assistance, Mrs. Whitaker, though as I was just telling your daughter, I didn't bring you here to work." Elizabeth straightened, her dignity intact despite her circumstances. "I prefer to earn my keep, Sheriff. I've never been one to accept charity." "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's reparation," Elizabeth suggested with a raised eyebrow. The sheriff's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "If that makes you more comfortable, then yes. Consider it reparation for the injustice you've suffered." The meal passed more comfortably than the previous nights, with Mrs. Hoffman carrying much of the conversation with news and gossip from town. Sarah noticed how the sheriff listened attentively to the older woman, showing genuine interest in the minutiae of small town life. After lunch, Mrs. Hoffman departed for her own home, leaving Sarah and Elizabeth alone with the sheriff. An awkward silence fell until Sheriff Fairchild cleared his throat. "I need to return to the office for a few hours," he said. "Please make yourselves at home. Mrs. Hoffman will be back tomorrow morning." After he left, Sarah helped her mother clean up from lunch, then returned to the garden while Elizabeth continued her mending. The afternoon passed quietly, with Sarah finding unexpected peace in the simple task of preparing soil for planting. When she finally returned to the house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. She found her mother in the kitchen preparing supper. "Has the sheriff returned?" she asked, washing the dirt from her hands. "Not yet," Elizabeth replied, "though Mrs. Hoffman mentioned he often works late." Sarah nodded, picking up a knife to help with the vegetables. "What do you think of him, Mother? Truly?" Elizabeth paused in her work. "I think he's a man with his own reasons for what he does. Whether those reasons align with our best interests remains to be seen. He told me about his mother and sister, how they were indentured after his father died and the man who bought their contracts mistreated them." "Did he?" Elizabeth looked thoughtful. "That explains much. But one good deed doesn't make him a saint, Sarah. We must remain cautious." "Of course," Sarah agreed, though privately she felt increasingly certain that Thomas Fairchild was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man trying to right a wrong. The sheriff returned as they were setting the table, bringing with him the smell of dust and horses and the wider world beyond the house's four walls. He looked tired but smiled when he saw the prepared meal. "You didn't need to cook," he said, removing his gunbelt and hanging it on a peg near the door, a gesture that struck Sarah as both practical and symbolic, as if he were leaving his official role outside. "We wanted to," Sarah replied before her mother could respond, "to thank you for your kindness." Dinner was simple roast chicken, potatoes, and the last of the previous season's preserved green beans, but the sheriff ate with obvious appreciation. Afterward, he insisted on helping with the dishes despite Elizabeth's protests. "My mother taught me that everyone in a household contributes," he explained as he rolled up his sleeves. "Even a sheriff who can't tell a potato from a turnip in the ground." The comment startled a laugh from Sarah, and she saw her mother's expression soften slightly. Later, as Sarah was preparing for bed, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Sheriff Fairchild standing in the hallway, holding a small stack of books. "I thought you might like something to read," he said, offering her the volumes. "I noticed you looking at the bookshelves earlier." Sarah accepted them with surprise. "Thank you, I didn't expect a frontier sheriff to have a library." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I wasn't always a lawman, Miss Whitaker. What were you before?" She asked, curious about this enigmatic man who had so dramatically altered their fate. "A student, a soldier, a wanderer," he shrugged. "Life takes unexpected turns for all of us, I suppose." "Indeed it does," Sarah agreed, thinking of her own circumstances. "Thank you for the books, Sheriff." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "When I'm not wearing the badge, I'm just Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her tongue. "Good night, then." "Good night, Sarah," he replied, then turned and walked away, leaving her wondering at the odd flutter in her chest when he'd spoken her name. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Sheriff Fairchild Thomas left early each morning for his duties in town, returning at midday for lunch when possible. Mrs. Hoffman came daily to help with housekeeping tasks and to provide companionship, becoming increasingly fond of both Sarah and Elizabeth. Sarah threw herself into the garden project, discovering a talent for coaxing life from the soil that she hadn't known she possessed. The physical labor helped her sleep at night and gave her a sense of contribution to the household that eased her conscience about their situation. Elizabeth, meanwhile, took over the management of the house with quiet efficiency, gradually transforming it from a bachelor's functional quarters to a real home. Thomas noticed the changes and expressed his appreciation, further thawing Elizabeth's initial reserve. It was nearly 2 weeks after their arrival when the first complication arose. Sarah was in town with Mrs. Hoffman, purchasing seeds for the garden, when she encountered the heavy-set man who had bid against Thomas at the auction. He blocked her path outside the general store, his expression unpleasant. "Well, if it ain't the sheriff's new housekeeper," he said, emphasizing the last word with a sneer. "Mighty convenient arrangement you've got there." Sarah straightened her spine. "Excuse me, sir, I need to pass." "Word around town is that Fairchild's keeping you both for himself. Can't say I blame him, pretty thing like you would tempt any man." Mrs. Hoffman stepped forward. "That's enough, Mr. Dayton. These ladies are under the sheriff's protection." "I bet they are," the man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Tell me, girl, does he make you earn your keep in his bed, or is he saving that pleasure for later?" Before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, Dayton?" Thomas stood a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. His expression was calm, but Sarah could see the cold anger in his eyes. Dayton's face flushed. "No problem, Sheriff, just passing the time of day with the ladies here." "Then I suggest you continue on your way, now." The larger man hesitated, then spat on the ground near Sarah's feet before shuffling off. Thomas watched him go, then turned to Sarah and Mrs. Hoffman. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern evident. "Yes," Sarah replied, though her heart was pounding. "He just said some unpleasant things." Mrs. Hoffman made a disgusted sound. Filthy talk, suggesting that you and the sheriff, well, it's not fit to repeat. Thomas's jaw tightened. I see, I'm sorry you had to endure that, Sarah. Unfortunately, small towns breed gossip, and our arrangement has given people something to talk about. It's not your fault, Sarah said quickly. You couldn't have known people would assume that. Perhaps I should have, he admitted. I wasn't thinking about appearances when I brought you and your mother home. I was only thinking about getting you away from that auction block, Mrs. Hoffman cleared her throat. If you'll excuse me, I need to check on a few things at the mercantile. I'll meet you back at the house, Sarah. After the older woman left, an awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Thomas spoke. I should return to the office. Will you be all right to walk back to the house alone? Of course, Sarah assured him. I'm not afraid of Mr. Dayton or his nasty insinuations. Thomas smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. You're a brave woman, Sarah Whitaker. Your father may have been a fool with money, but he raised a daughter with spirit. The compliment warmed her. Thank you, though much of the credit goes to my mother. Indeed, he agreed. She's a remarkable woman as well, you're both. Well, you've brought something back to that house that's been missing for a long time. With that cryptic comment, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Sarah to wonder exactly what he meant and why his words made her heart beat just a little faster. When Sarah returned to the house, she found her mother in a state of agitation. What's wrong? She asked, setting down her purchases. We had a visitor while you were out, Elizabeth said, her voice tight. Mr. Gerald Blackwell from the bank. He came to inform us that our indenture contracts were never properly filed and therefore may not be legally binding. What does that mean? It means Sheriff Fairchild may not actually have legal ownership of our services, Elizabeth explained. And if that's the case, the bank could potentially sell us again to recover the remaining debt. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. They can't do that. Thomas the sheriff, he paid for our contracts. Apparently, there was some procedural error. Mr. Blackwell seemed quite pleased about it. Did he say what will happen next? Elizabeth sank into a chair. There will be a hearing before the circuit judge next week. Until then, we are to remain here under Sheriff Fairchild's guardianship. Sarah paced the kitchen, her mind racing. This can't be happening, not again. Mr. Blackwell made another offer, Elizabeth said quietly. He said if I were to marry him, he would consider the debt settled. Marry him? Sarah stopped short. Mother, you can't be considering it. He's a widower with means, Sarah. It would secure our future. He's also the man who put us on that auction block in the first place. How could you even think of binding yourself to such a person? Elizabeth's expression hardened. I am thinking of our survival. What happens if the judge rules against us? What happens when Sheriff Fairchild tires of his charity case and sends us away? We have no money, no property, and precious few options. Thomas wouldn't do that, Sarah insisted. He's not that kind of man. Oh, Sarah, her mother sighed. You've always been too quick to see the good in people. Men like Sheriff Fairchild don't take in strangers without expecting something in return. We've been fortunate that he hasn't demanded anything yet, but that doesn't mean he won't. You're wrong about him, Sarah said firmly. He helped us because it was right, not because he wanted something from us. Elizabeth studied her daughter's face. You care for him, she said, making it a statement rather than a question. After less than 2 weeks, you're defending him like you have feelings for him. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. I respect him. He saved us from a terrible fate. Only to possibly deliver us to another, Elizabeth countered. If this hearing goes against us, we could find ourselves back where we started or worse. Then we'll fight it, Sarah declared. We'll find a way to pay the remaining debt ourselves. With what, Sarah? Everything we had was sold to cover your father's gambling losses. What skills do we have that would earn enough money quickly enough? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Sarah thought of the garden she'd worked so hard to prepare, the meals she'd cooked, the small improvements she'd made around the house, none of which would translate into the kind of money they needed. I don't know, she admitted finally. But there must be a way that doesn't involve either of us being sold again or you marrying that horrible man. When Thomas returned that evening, his expression told them he already knew about Blackwell's visit. He hung his hat and gun belt with deliberate care before turning to face them. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I should have made sure the paperwork was properly filed. This is my fault." "It's not your fault," Sarah said quickly. "It's the bank looking for any excuse to extract more money." Thomas nodded grimly. "Blackwell has wanted to expand his influence in this town for years. Forcing your mother to marry him would give him the respectability he craves." Elizabeth looked surprised. "You know about his proposal?" "Word travels fast," Thomas said. "And Blackwell wasn't exactly discreet about his intentions when he came to my office this afternoon to gloat." "What did he say?" Sarah asked. Thomas's expression darkened. "Nothing worth repeating in front of ladies. But he made it clear that he intends to win this case and claim what he believes is owed to him one way or another." "And what do you believe our chances are at this hearing?" Elizabeth asked. "Honestly, it depends on the judge. Jacob Wheeler is a fair man, but he's bound by the law. If the contracts weren't properly filed," he shook his head. "I've sent for a lawyer from Helena who specializes in these matters. He should arrive in a few days." "A lawyer costs money," Elizabeth pointed out, "money we don't have." "The expense is mine," Thomas said firmly. "I got you into this situation, I'll get you out." "You've already spent $800 on us," Sarah protested. "We can't ask you to spend more." Thomas looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "You're not asking, I'm offering. And I would spend twice that amount to keep you both from falling into Blackwell's hands." The vehemence of his statement silenced both women. After a moment, Elizabeth spoke. "You are very kind, Sheriff Fairchild, but I must ask why. Why go to such lengths for people who are essentially strangers to you?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "You're not strangers anymore," he said quietly, "and I told Sarah about my mother and sister. What I didn't mention was that I was too young, too powerless to help them then. I'm neither young nor powerless now." The raw emotion in his voice touched something in Sarah. She moved toward him without thinking and placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said simply. His gaze held hers for a long moment, and Sarah felt that strange flutter in her chest again. Then he stepped back, breaking the connection. "We should prepare for the worst while hoping for the best," he said, his voice once again practical. "The hearing is scheduled for next Tuesday. Until then, I suggest we continue as we have been." That night, sleep eluded Sarah. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the precariousness of their situation. Just when she'd begun to feel safe, to imagine a future where she and her mother might rebuild their lives, everything was threatened again. And then there was Thomas. Sarah could no longer deny, at least to herself, that her feelings for him had grown beyond simple gratitude. There was something about his quiet strength, his unwavering moral compass, that drew her to him. But was she mistaking kindness for something more? And even if she wasn't, what future could there possibly be for a penniless, scandal-tainted woman and the town sheriff? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She sat up, pulling her shawl around her nightdress. "Yes, Sarah, it's your mother. May I come in?" "Of course." Elizabeth entered, looking as sleepless as Sarah felt. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her daughter's hand. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about Sheriff Fairchild. Perhaps you're right that I've been too quick to doubt his motives." "You were just being cautious," Sarah said. "After everything that's happened, it's understandable." "Yes, but I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Elizabeth squeezed Sarah's hand. "And I've seen how you look at him." Sarah felt her face warm. "Mother, I won't pretend I don't have concerns. He's older than you and your circumstances are complicated. But he's a good man, Sarah, better than most." "It doesn't matter," Sarah said, though her heart ached at the words. "Even if I did have feelings for him, which I'm not saying I do, nothing could come of it. Not with this hearing looming over us and the possibility that we could be forced to leave." Elizabeth was silent for a moment. "What if I did accept Mr. Blackwell's proposal?" she asked finally. "It would secure our position and you could stay here in Montana City, perhaps even continue to see the sheriff." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself like that." "We'll find another way." "There may not be another way, my dear." "There is always another way," Sarah insisted, "and we will find it together." Elizabeth smiled sadly. You remind me so much of myself at your age, so determined, so sure that goodness will prevail. She rose from the bed. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is another day, and we'll need our strength for whatever it brings. After her mother left, Sarah returned to her restless contemplation of the ceiling. Despite her brave words, she couldn't imagine what solution might present itself before Tuesday's hearing. The debt was real, even if the manner of collection had been questionable. And Thomas, for all his generosity, could not be expected to continue indefinitely as their protector. The lawyer from Helena arrived 2 days later, a serious young man named Adam Prescott, who spent hours closeted with Thomas, reviewing documents and legal precedents. Sarah kept herself busy in the garden, finding solace in the physical labor and the simple miracle of growing things. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting the seeds she'd purchased in town when a shadow fell across her work. Looking up, she found Thomas watching her. Mr. Prescott thinks he's found an approach that might work, he said without preamble. It's not guaranteed, but it's better than nothing. Sarah sat back on her heels, brushing soil from her hands. What is it? He believes we can argue that the debt should have died with your father, that extending it to you and your mother constitutes a form of illegal servitude prohibited by the 13th Amendment. Do you think Judge Wheeler will accept that argument? Thomas sighed. It's hard to say. The practice of indentured servitude exists in a legal gray area these days. Some judges consider it a legitimate form of debt repayment, while others view it as contrary to the spirit of the amendment. And if he rules against us, then we appeal, Thomas said firmly, and in the meantime, you and your mother remain under my protection. Sarah studied his determined expression. You can't fight the entire banking system, Thomas. Watch me, he replied, a hint of steel in his voice. She couldn't help but smile at his confidence. You're a good man, Thomas Fairchild. I try to be, he said, returning her smile. Then, more seriously, Sarah, whatever happens at this hearing, I want you to know that these past weeks, having you and your mother here, it's been the closest thing to a real home I've had in a very long time. The words sent a rush of warmth through her. For us as well, she admitted. After my father died, I wasn't sure we'd ever have a home again. You'll always have one here, he said quietly, if you want it. Before Sarah could respond to this declaration, Mrs. Hoffman's voice called from the house, announcing that lunch was ready. The moment broken, Thomas offered his hand to help Sarah to her feet. The brief contact sent a jolt of awareness through her that lingered long after they'd gone inside. The day of the hearing dawned clear and unnaturally warm for early May. Sarah dressed with care in her best dress, one of the few possessions she'd been allowed to keep, and helped her mother with her hair. Elizabeth looked pale but composed, her years of maintaining appearances through her husband's various scandals serving her well now. Thomas was waiting for them downstairs, dressed in a formal black suit that Sarah had never seen before. The change from his usual practical attire was striking, highlighting the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. For a moment, she could imagine him in another life, perhaps as the student he'd once been, or in some eastern city where his intelligence and integrity would have led him to prominence. You both look lovely, he said, his eyes lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than was strictly proper. Mr. Prescott arrived shortly after, bringing with him a portfolio of documents and a quiet confidence that Sarah found reassuring. They walked together to the town hall where the circuit court was held, drawing curious glances from townspeople along the way. Inside, the room was already crowded. Sarah recognized many faces from town, their expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed hostility. Gerald Blackwell sat near the front with his lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown. Blackwell turned as they entered, his gaze traveling slowly over Sarah and her mother in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl. The hearing began with Judge Wheeler, a white-haired man with a stern countenance, calling for order. The bank's lawyer presented their case first, arguing that the debt remained valid and that the auction had been legal despite the procedural error in filing the indenture contracts. When it was Mr. Prescott's turn, he spoke eloquently about the spirit of the law versus its letter, about the injustice of transferring a deceased man's debt to his widow and daughter, and about the questionable practice of indentured servitude in a nation that had abolished slavery a decade earlier. Throughout the proceedings, Sarah was acutely aware of Thomas sitting beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. Once, when Blackwell's lawyer made a particularly cutting remark about her father's character, Thomas's hand found hers beneath the table, giving it a gentle squeeze before releasing it. Finally, after both sides had presented their arguments, Judge Wheeler called Elizabeth to testify. She walked to the front of the room with dignity, swore to tell the truth, and faced the judge's questions with calm honesty. "Mrs. Whitaker, did you consent to the auction of yourself and your daughter?" Judge Wheeler asked. "I was told there was no alternative if I wished to settle my late husband's debt," Elizabeth replied. "And were you aware that such an arrangement might not be legally binding?" "No, Your Honor. I was told it was perfectly legal." "By whom, Mr. Blackwell, Your Honor?" A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Wheeler silenced it with a look before continuing. "And since Sheriff Fairchild purchased your contracts, how have you been treated?" Elizabeth's voice was clear and steady. "With nothing but kindness and respect, Your Honor. Sheriff Fairchild has provided us with shelter and security, asking nothing in return except that we consider his home our own." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. You may step down." Next, it was Sarah's turn to testify. As she took her place before the judge, she caught Thomas's eye. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. "Miss Whitaker," Judge Wheeler began, "do you corroborate your mother's account of events?" "I do, Your Honor." "And you have no complaints about your treatment in Sheriff Fairchild's household?" "None whatsoever, Your Honor." "Sheriff Fairchild has been a perfect gentleman and a true friend to us both in our time of need." The judge studied her for a moment. "It has been suggested by some in this community that the sheriff's interest in you and your mother might not be entirely proper." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with indignation. "Those suggestions are entirely false, Your Honor. Sheriff Fairchild's only interest has been in righting a wrong." "I see." Judge Wheeler made a note on the paper before him. "Thank you, Miss Whitaker. You may return to your seat." Finally, Thomas was called to testify. He spoke clearly and concisely, explaining his actions and his belief that the auction had been fundamentally unjust. When questioned about his motives, he recounted the story of his mother and sister, his voice tight with old pain. "So this was a personal crusade for you, Sheriff?" the judge asked. "I suppose you could call it that, Your Honor," Thomas admitted, "but I'd like to think that any decent man would have done the same if they had the means. Yet you were the only one to step forward that day." Thomas's gaze briefly met Sarah's across the room. "Sometimes, Your Honor, doing the right thing means standing alone." After all testimony had been given, Judge Wheeler announced that he would consider the arguments and deliver his ruling the following morning. The crowd dispersed slowly, with many lingering to discuss the day's events in hushed voices. Outside, Blackwell intercepted their group, his expression unpleasant. "Quite a performance in there, Sheriff," he sneered. "Almost had me believing you're some kind of saint." Thomas regarded him coolly. "I'm no saint, Blackwell, just a man who knows right from wrong. We'll see what the judge has to say about that tomorrow." Blackwell's gaze shifted to Elizabeth. "My offer still stands, Mrs. Whitaker. One word from you and all this unpleasantness ends." "That's enough," Thomas said, stepping between them. "Mrs. Whitaker has made her feelings clear." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over, Fairchild, not by a long shot." He turned and walked away, his lawyer hurrying to keep up. That evening, dinner was a subdued affair. Mr. Prescott had joined them, and the conversation focused mainly on the day's proceedings and possible outcomes. After the meal, Elizabeth excused herself early, the strain of the day evident in her drawn features. Sarah helped Mrs. Hoffman clear the table, then found herself alone with Thomas on the front porch. The night was warm and still, with a sky full of stars stretching endlessly above them. "You think we have a chance?" she asked quietly. Thomas leaned against the porch railing. "Mr. Prescott seems to think so. Wheeler is known for being fair-minded, and if we lose, "Then we fight on," he said simply. "I meant what I said, Sarah. You and your mother will always have a home here." She turned to look at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "Why? And please don't tell me it's just because of what happened to your family. There's more to it than that, isn't there?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Yes, there's more." "Then tell me," she urged. He turned to face her fully then, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "From the moment I saw you on that auction block, standing there with your head held high despite everything, I knew you were someone special. And these past weeks, watching you rebuild your life with such courage and grace." He shook his head slightly. "You've brought something into my life I didn't know I was missing, Sarah." "And what's that?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning. "Light," he said simply. "Warmth, purpose beyond just enforcing the law." He stepped closer to her. "I know our circumstances are complicated. I know the timing couldn't be worse. But I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, my feelings for you won't change." "And what are those feelings, Thomas?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Instead of answering with words, he reached up to gently cup her face in his hands. His eyes asked a question, and her smile gave the answer. When his lips met hers, Sarah felt as though every star in the vast Montana sky had somehow found its way into her heart. The kiss was gentle and brief, but it held the promise of more, a future neither of them had dared imagine until this moment. When they finally stepped apart, Thomas kept hold of her hands. "I love you, Sarah Whitaker," he said, the words both a declaration and a vow. "And whatever the judge decides tomorrow, that won't change. I love you too," she replied, the words coming easily now that they'd been set free. "I think I have almost from the beginning, though I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Not gratitude, then?" "No," she assured him, "though I am grateful, of course, but this." She squeezed his hands. "This is something else entirely." A sound from inside the house reminded them that they weren't completely alone. Thomas reluctantly stepped back, though his eyes still held hers. "We should go in," he said. "Tomorrow will come early enough." "Yes," Sarah agreed, though she was reluctant to end this perfect moment. "Thomas." "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens," he interrupted gently, "we'll face it together. I promise you that." Sarah slept fitfully that night, her dreams a confused jumble of courtroom scenes and Thomas's kiss. She woke early before dawn had fully broken and dressed with trembling hands. Today would determine their future, or at least the next phase of their struggle. Downstairs, she found Thomas already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a troubled expression. He rose when she entered, his face lighting up despite his obvious concern. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee, please," Sarah replied, taking the cup he offered. "Have you been up long?" "Most of the night," he admitted, "thinking about what might happen today." "And what conclusions did you reach during your midnight contemplations?" She asked, trying to keep her tone light. "That I've never wanted anything as much as I want the judge to rule in our favor," he said honestly. "Not for my sake, but for yours and your mother's." Sarah reached across the table to take his hand. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." "Isn't that what you said last night?" His smile was tender. "Indeed I did." Elizabeth joined them shortly after, looking more rested than she had the previous evening. If she noticed the changed atmosphere between Sarah and Thomas, she gave no sign of it, focusing instead on preparing herself mentally for the day ahead. Mr. Prescott arrived as they were finishing a light breakfast, his expression cautiously optimistic. "I've been thinking about yesterday's proceedings," he told them. "Judge Wheeler seemed particularly interested in Mrs. Whitaker's testimony about being told the auction was legal. That suggests he may be considering the element of misrepresentation." "Is that good for us?" Sarah asked. "It could be," the lawyer replied. "If the judge determines that the bank deliberately misled your mother about her legal options, it would strengthen our case considerably." They walked to the town hall together, the streets already busy despite the early hour. Word of the hearing had spread throughout Montana City and beyond, drawing curious onlookers from neighboring settlements. Sarah held her head high as they passed through the crowd, determined not to show fear or uncertainty. Inside, the room was even more crowded than the day before. Sarah, Elizabeth, Thomas, and Mr. Prescott took their seats at the front, while Blackwell and his lawyer sat across the aisle, the banker's face set in lines of smug confidence. Judge Wheeler entered, and a hush fell over the assembly. He took his place and surveyed the room with a stern expression before speaking. After careful consideration of the arguments presented yesterday and review of the relevant laws and precedents, I am prepared to deliver my ruling in the matter of Whitaker versus Montana Territorial Bank. Sarah felt Thomas's hand find hers beneath the table. She gripped it tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. The question before this court, Judge Wheeler continued, is whether the indenture contracts for Elizabeth and Sarah Whitaker were legally valid, and consequently, whether Sheriff Thomas Fairchild's purchase of those contracts constitutes legal ownership of their services. The judge paused, his gaze moving between the two parties. I find that while the practice of indentured servitude remains legal in certain narrowly defined circumstances within this territory, the manner in which these particular contracts were created and executed falls outside those circumstances. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah barely dared to breathe. Specifically, the judge went on, I find that Mrs. Whitaker was deliberately misinformed about her legal options following her husband's death, and that the bank's actions in placing her and her daughter up for auction were improperly motivated by factors beyond simple debt collection. Blackwell's face darkened with anger, but he remained silent. Furthermore, Judge Wheeler said, his voice gaining strength, I find that the spirit, if not the letter, of the 13th Amendment applies in this case. While indentured servitude is not explicitly prohibited by territorial law, the involuntary auction of individuals to satisfy a deceased person's debt comes perilously close to the institution of slavery that amendment was designed to abolish. Sarah felt hope rising in her chest. Therefore, I rule that the indenture contracts for Elizabeth and Sarah Whitaker are null and void, both due to procedural errors in their creation and fundamental questions about their legality. A cheer erupted from several people in the crowd. Judge Wheeler silenced them with a raised hand. However, he continued, and Sarah's heart sank at the word, I also find that the debt to Montana Territorial Bank remains valid. The bank has a right to seek payment through legal means, which do not include the indentured servitude of the deceased's family members. Blackwell leaned forward, a triumphant smile beginning to form on his face. Given the unusual circumstances of this case, the judge said, I am setting the remaining debt at $300 to be paid within 60 days. If payment is not made within that time frame, the bank may pursue other legal remedies, including seizure of any assets belonging to the Whitaker estate. Sarah's mind raced. $300 was far less than the original debt, but still an impossible sum for them to raise in 2 months. Court is adjourned, Judge Wheeler declared, bringing his gavel down with finality. The room erupted into conversation as people rose to leave. Thomas turned to Mr. Prescott. Is this a victory or a defeat? He asked. Both, the lawyer replied honestly. The judge invalidated the indenture contracts, which means Mrs. Whitaker and Miss Whitaker are free women, but they still owe the bank money they don't have. Elizabeth looked dazed. $300 in 60 days. How could we possibly raise such a sum? Thomas's expression was determined. I'll provide it, he said. I have savings. No, Sarah said firmly. You've done enough already. We can't accept more of your charity. It's not charity, he insisted. It's a loan, she interrupted. If you're determined to help, then it will be a loan that we will repay with interest. Thomas looked as though he wanted to argue but finally nodded. Very well. A loan. As they left the town hall, Blackwell intercepted them once more. Congratulations on your partial victory, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, but don't celebrate too soon. $300 is still $300, and I'll be counting every day until the deadline. The money will be paid, Thomas said coldly, on time and in full, Blackwell's smile was unpleasant. "We'll see about that, Sheriff." He tipped his hat mockingly to Elizabeth. "My offer still stands, Mrs. Whitaker. It would be so much simpler than scrambling to find money you don't have." "I'd rather scrub floors for the rest of my life than marry you, Mr. Blackwell," Elizabeth replied with quiet dignity. "Good day to you." They left him standing there, his face mottled with anger. As they walked back toward Thomas's house, Sarah felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. They had won their freedom, but the specter of debt still hung over them. "I need to return to my office," Thomas said when they reached the house. "There are matters that have been neglected during all this." He turned to Mr. Prescott. "Thank you for your excellent representation. Please send your bill to me directly." "Of course," the lawyer replied, shaking his hand. "And may I say, it was an honor to be part of such an important case. The judge's ruling on indentured servitude could have implications throughout the territory." After Mr. Prescott departed, Thomas lingered for a moment. "We'll talk more this evening," he said to Sarah, his eyes conveying a deeper meaning. "There are matters we need to discuss." "Yes," she agreed, her heart quickening at his gaze. "This evening." After Thomas left, Sarah and Elizabeth sat in the kitchen, trying to process the events of the morning. Mrs. Hoffman arrived shortly after, full of questions about the hearing and bursting with town gossip about the case. "Everyone's talking about it," she reported as she helped prepare lunch. "Most folks think the judge made the right decision, though there are some who say he should have thrown out the debt entirely." "That would have been nice," Sarah said wryly. Mrs. Hoffman patted her hand. "Don't you worry about that money, dear. The sheriff's good for it." "We're not taking Sheriff Fairchild's money," Elizabeth said firmly. "We need to find a way to earn it ourselves." "Doing what?" Mrs. Hoffman asked practically. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Whitaker, but there aren't many jobs for ladies in Montana City that pay well enough to save $300 in 2 months. "There must be something," Sarah insisted. "We can't just marry our way out of this situation." Mrs. Hoffman looked thoughtful. "Well, there is one possibility, though I hesitate to mention it." "Please do," Elizabeth encouraged. "Mrs. Foster over at the hotel is looking for someone to help manage the place. Her husband passed last winter, and she's been struggling to keep up with everything. It wouldn't pay $300, but it might be a start." Sarah and Elizabeth exchanged looks. "It's worth investigating," Elizabeth said. "Perhaps between the two of us we could earn enough." "I'll speak to Mrs. Foster this afternoon," Mrs. Hoffman promised. "She and I attend the same church." True to her word, Mrs. Hoffman returned that evening with news. "Mrs. Foster would be delighted to hire you both," she reported. "Mrs. Whitaker to help with the bookkeeping and correspondence, and Miss Whitaker to assist with the guests and meal planning. The pay isn't grand $15 a month for each of you, but she's offering room and board as part of the arrangement. $30 a month," Elizabeth calculated. "Even with 2 months, that's only $60 toward our debt." "It's a start," Sarah said, trying to remain positive. "And perhaps there are other opportunities as well," Mrs. Hoffman hesitated. "There is one other thing. Mrs. Foster mentioned that several of her regular boarders have expressed interest in." "Well, in your garden, Miss Sarah." "My garden?" Sarah was confused. "It's hardly more than a patch of turned soil with a few seedlings." "Not this one," Mrs. Hoffman clarified. "The one you might plant. Mrs. Foster says there's good land behind the hotel that's never been used. She'd be willing to let you plant a proper vegetable garden there and to sell what you grow to her boarders and other folks in town." Sarah considered this. "I don't know the first thing about running such a business, but you do know how to make things grow," Mrs. Hoffman pointed out. "I've never seen anyone with such a way with plants, and fresh vegetables fetch a good price in Montana City, especially with all the miners coming through." "It's worth considering," Elizabeth agreed, looking at her daughter with new appreciation. "You've always had a gift with growing things, Sarah. Perhaps this is how we use that gift to our advantage." When Thomas returned that evening, they shared the news of Mrs. Foster's offer. He listened silently, his expression unreadable. When they'd finished, he remained quiet for a long moment. "So you intend to move to the hotel?" he finally asked. It seems the most practical solution, Elizabeth replied. We can earn some money toward our debt and will no longer be imposing on your hospitality. You've never been an imposition, Thomas said quietly, his eyes finding Sarah's. But I understand your desire to be independent. After dinner, as Elizabeth and Mrs. Hoffman cleared the table, Thomas asked Sarah to join him on the porch. The evening was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the newly planted garden. I had imagined a different conversation for this evening, he said once they were alone. One that didn't involve you moving to the hotel. Sarah leaned against the porch railing. It's not what I imagined either, but Mother is right, we need to be independent to pay our own way. There are other ways to achieve that, he said carefully, ways that wouldn't involve you leaving. Such as, Thomas took a deep breath, I had planned to wait to give you more time, but circumstances seem to be forcing my hand. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that gleamed in the fading light. Sarah Whitaker, I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day at the auction block. Will you marry me? The simple gold band he held out caught the last rays of the setting sun. Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding. Thomas, I don't know what to say. Say yes, he urged. Not because of the debt or the circumstances, but because you feel as I do. I do love you, she admitted, but marriage, it's such a serious step. It is, he agreed. One I wouldn't suggest if I weren't completely certain of my feelings. Sarah hesitated. What about my mother? She would, of course, continue to live with us. This house has room enough for 3, and if God blesses us with children, we can always add to it. And the debt would be settled, he said simply. As my wife, your debts would become mine. Sarah shook her head slowly. That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Thomas, that you're proposing to solve our financial problems rather than because you truly wish to marry me. Sarah, he said, taking her hand, I've been alone for a very long time. I've watched other men find wives, start families, build lives while I focused on upholding the law. I never thought I would find someone who would make me want more than that solitary existence. His blue eyes held hers intently. Until you, the sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. I'm afraid, she confessed, afraid that once the novelty wears off, you'll regret binding yourself to a woman with no fortune, no connections, and a scandalous past. Never, he said firmly. I see you for exactly who you are, Sarah, strong, kind, resilient, the woman who brought my neglected garden back to life, who filled my silent house with laughter, who challenges me and supports me in equal measure. He lifted her hand to his lips. The woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes when you put it that way. Say yes, he whispered, please. Looking into his eyes, Sarah knew there was only one answer she could give. Yes, she breathed. Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Fairchild. His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally separated, Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. We should tell my mother, she said after a moment, though I'm not sure how she'll receive the news. With grace and wisdom, I hope, Thomas replied, but regardless, my offer stands. You and your mother will always have a home with me. They found Elizabeth in the kitchen, finishing the evening dishes with Mrs. Hoffman. Both women looked up as they entered, their expressions turning curious when they noticed Sarah and Thomas's clasped hands. Mother, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves, Thomas has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment she said nothing, and Sarah feared the worst. Then, to her surprise, her mother's eyes filled with tears. Oh, my dear, Elizabeth said, crossing the room to embrace her daughter. I had hoped, but I didn't dare to believe. You're not upset? Sarah asked, returning the embrace. Upset? My darling girl, all I have ever wanted is for you to find a good man who would love and cherish you as you deserve. Elizabeth turned to Thomas, taking his hand. And I believe you have found such a man. Mrs. Hoffman was beaming. Well, isn't this just the most wonderful news? When will the wedding be? Thomas and Sarah exchanged looks. We haven't discussed the details yet, Thomas admitted. Soon, I hope, Sarah added, squeezing his hand. There will be much to prepare, Elizabeth said, practicality asserting itself through her emotion. And of course, we'll need to inform Mrs. Foster that we won't be taking the positions at the hotel after all. Actually, Sarah said, I've been thinking about that. I would still like to establish the vegetable garden behind the hotel. It could be a way for me to contribute to our household income and for us to repay Thomas for settling our debt. Thomas looked surprised. You don't need to repay me, Sarah. What's mine is yours now. Nevertheless, she insisted, it's important to me to contribute to build something of my own. He studied her face, then nodded. I understand, and I think it's an excellent idea. You have a gift with growing things. Then it's settled, Elizabeth declared. Sarah will start her garden business and she hesitated. I suppose I should find a way to contribute as well, Mrs. Hoffman mentioned that you're skilled with bookkeeping and correspondence, Thomas said. As it happens, the town council has been discussing the need for someone to organize the municipal records. It's a position that would suit your talents admirably. Elizabeth looked thoughtful. That does sound interesting, and it would allow me to maintain some independence while still being part of this family. This family, Sarah repeated, the words filling her with warmth. It has a wonderful sound, doesn't it? The weeks that followed were filled with preparations for both the wedding and Sarah's new gardening venture. Thomas cleared the land behind the hotel, turning the soil and building raised beds to Sarah's specifications. Mrs. Foster, delighted by the arrangement, spread the word among her boarders and other townspeople about the fresh vegetables that would soon be available. Elizabeth, meanwhile, took on the challenge of organizing Montana City's chaotic records, discovering a talent for administration that soon made her indispensable to the town council. The modest salary she earned, combined with her sense of purpose, brought a new vibrancy to her manner. As for Sarah and Thomas, their love deepened with each passing day. They worked side by side in the garden when his duties permitted, talking about their hopes for the future and learning the small details of each other's lives that transform strangers into beloved companions. The wedding took place on a perfect June day, with wildflowers decorating the small church, and seemingly the entire population of Montana City in attendance. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue, silk, a gift from Thomas that had arrived mysteriously from Helena, and carried a bouquet of flowers from her own garden. Judge Wheeler performed the ceremony, his usually stern face softened by a genuine smile as he pronounced them husband and wife. When Thomas kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled guests that could probably be heard all the way to the next county. The celebration afterwards spilled out from the church onto the town square, with music and dancing continuing well into the night. Sarah, whirling in her husband's arms under the star-filled Montana sky, felt a happiness so complete it seemed almost unreal. Mrs. Fairchild, Thomas murmured in her ear as they danced. How does it sound? Like the most beautiful name in the world, she replied, smiling up at him. Though not quite as beautiful as home. Later that night, alone in the bedroom that was now theirs together, Sarah discovered the final piece of the happiness she had found in Montana City, the tender passion of a man who loved her completely and the joyful surrender of her heart to that love. Gerald Blackwell appeared at the sheriff's office the day after the wedding, his expression sour. I hear congratulations are in order, he said without sincerity. How convenient that your marriage solves the Whitaker debt problem. Thomas regarded him calmly from behind his desk. The debt will be paid in full today, Blackwell. I've already written the bank draft. And what about the interest? There will be no interest, Thomas said firmly. Judge Wheeler's ruling specified $300, and that's what you'll receive. Blackwell's face darkened. This isn't over, Fairchild. Yes, it is, Thomas replied, standing to his full height. The debt is settled, the Whitaker women are free, and if you continue to harass my family, you'll find yourself facing charges of your own. Your family, Blackwell sneered. A wife young enough to be your daughter and a mother-in-law with a scandalous past. You've made your bed, Sheriff. I hope you enjoy lying in it. Thomas stepped around the desk, his patience at an end. Get out of my office, Blackwell. And stay away from my wife and her mother, or you'll answer to me not as the sheriff, but as a husband protecting his family." The banker hesitated, then backed down, muttering threats under his breath as he departed. Thomas watched him go, knowing that Blackwell's resentment might cause problems in the future, but confident in his ability to protect what was his. As summer turned to autumn, Sarah's garden flourished beyond all expectations. The vegetables she grew, tomatoes, beans, carrots, and more, found eager buyers among the townspeople, and Mrs. Foster's boarders raved about the fresh produce that now graced their table daily. By the end of August, Sarah had earned enough to repay Thomas the full $300 he had given to the bank, despite his protests that it wasn't necessary. "It's not about the money," she explained as she handed him the carefully saved dollars. "It's about starting our marriage on equal footing, about knowing that I've contributed my share." Thomas accepted the money with a smile that spoke of his pride in her determination. "You contribute far more than money to our life together, Sarah. But I understand what this means to you, and I respect it." Elizabeth, too, had found her place in their household and in the community. Her work organizing the town records had expanded into a position as unofficial town clerk, with responsibilities that included correspondence with territorial officials and documentation of local government decisions. The role suited her natural dignity and intelligence, earning her the respect of even those who had initially viewed her with suspicion. In late September, Sarah confirmed what she had begun to suspect: she was expecting a child. When she shared the news with Thomas, his joy was boundless. He lifted her off her feet and spun her around their kitchen, laughing with pure delight. "A baby," he said in wonder, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child. Due in the spring," Sarah told him, covering his hand with her own. "Just in time for the new planting season." Elizabeth received the news with happy tears and immediate practical concerns about preparing for the child. Within days, she had begun knitting tiny garments and discussing with Mrs. Hoffman the best arrangements for the nursery. As Sarah's body changed with the growing life within her, Montana City prepared for winter. Thomas added a new room to their house, a nursery adjacent to the main bedroom, working on it in the evenings and on his days off. Sarah continued to tend her garden as long as the weather permitted, preserving the last of the harvest for winter use and planning expansions for the following spring. One evening in early December, as snow fell softly outside their windows, Thomas sat beside Sarah on the sofa, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Elizabeth was across the room, reading by lamplight, the picture of contentment. "I was thinking about the day we met," Thomas said quietly. "How different everything might have been if I hadn't received that telegram about the auction." Sarah leaned into his embrace. "I try not to think about that alternative. It's too frightening to contemplate." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Elizabeth commented, looking up from her book. "Even through terrible circumstances like that auction, something beautiful can emerge." "More than beautiful," Thomas agreed, pressing a kiss to Sarah's temple. "A miracle, a family." Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this point, from the humiliation of the auction block to the warmth of this home filled with love. She remembered Thomas's words that day: "You'll both have a home and a name." He had kept that promise, giving them not just shelter and legal protection, but a place to belong, a name to be proud of, and a love that had transformed all their lives. "A family," she echoed, feeling the baby move beneath her hand. "The greatest blessing of all." As the snow continued to fall outside, wrapping Montana City in a blanket of pristine white, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, bound together by love, respect, and the shared knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if one has the courage to believe in second chances. In April of 1877, as the first shoots of green appeared in Sarah's expanded garden, she gave birth to a son. They named him William, after Thomas's father, with Michael as a middle name to honor Elizabeth's late father. The boy had his mother's dark hair and his father's striking blue eyes, a perfect blend of their features that delighted everyone who saw him. Thomas took to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to all his responsibilities, often carrying the infant around town as he made his rounds, proudly introducing him to everyone they encountered. Sarah's heart swelled every time she saw them together, her strong, serious husband transformed by the simple joy of holding his son. Over the years that followed, Montana City grew and prospered, as did the Fairchild family. Sarah's garden business expanded into a thriving enterprise that supplied vegetables to most of the town, and eventually included a small greenhouse where she could start seedlings early in the season. Elizabeth became the official town clerk, her organizational skills and refined manner bringing a new level of respectability to local government proceedings. 2 more children joined the family. A daughter, Grace, born in 1879, and another son, Robert, who arrived in 1882. The house expanded along with the family, with Thomas adding rooms and modern conveniences as they became available. Through it all, the love between Sarah and Thomas only deepened, weathering the challenges of frontier life with the strength that came from complete trust and mutual respect. Gerald Blackwell eventually left Montana City, his banking business undermined by a series of poor investments and his reputation damaged by rumors of unethical practices. No one mourned his departure, least of all the Fairchilds. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Sarah with a gold locket containing miniature portraits of their 3 children. As he fastened it around her neck, he whispered, "Thank you for saying yes that day on the porch. For believing in the possibility of a future together despite everything." Sarah turned in his arms, her face alight with the same beauty that had first captured his heart, though now lined with the evidence of a decade of smiles and occasional tears. "I think I knew from that first day, from the moment you said we'd have a home and a name, that you were a man like no other, a man worth loving. And I knew from the moment I saw you standing on that auction block, head held high despite everything, that you were the woman I'd been waiting for all my life," he replied, pulling her close. "The woman who would make my house a home and my life complete." As they stood together, surrounded by the life they'd built from such unlikely beginnings, both Sarah and Thomas knew with absolute certainty that the journey had been worth every step, from the darkest day of the auction to the bright promise of all the days yet to come. And in the years that followed, when their grandchildren gathered around to hear the story of how their family began, Sarah would always begin the tale the same way. "It started on the worst day of my life, which became the best day when a tall sheriff with kind eyes said the words that changed everything: you'll both have a home and a name."